Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm working on a 2015 Armada and it's made by Nissan. We will be doing a brake job on this car front and back. We won't be changing the rotors. They're still good. They still have the same amount of thickness as needed. We're going to be just changing over the pads and making sure that everything is still a-okay with the pistons before we reassemble everything. Make sure all those calipers are still functioning well and we can get on our way. Now if you stumbled into this corner of YouTube, I thank you, and remember to like and subscribe. Every single follow helps my channel grow. Remember, when you like and subscribe, it brings me some extra attention to my channel and I thoroughly appreciate that. Remember, you can check out my merch for sale and my eBay channel, which is also listed in my description on my channel. Right now I'm filming how to do the rear brakes on this Armada. Alright guys, this brings us back to our true star of the day, which is this Armada. It's a Nissan and they started this body style in 2004 and led it all the way up to 2016. Now when I walk you around it, this is the platinum model of this Armada. It has a lot of the bells and whistles that Nissan offered, and it was a very luxurious vehicle for its time, and it still holds up to this day, which is almost 9 years old. Now, with time, everything starts to get a little bit older, so we're going to be doing the maintenance on this vehicle at this point. Now, as I'm showing you here, in the last little bit of the clip, we're using a 21mm socket to get in there and remove these lug nuts. Now, you're going to want to use an impact-rated wrench and impact-rated socket. Most likely, you're going to need a deep well socket. Sometimes you can get away with the short ones, but right now, this is the best option for removing these lugs. Now, if you want, you can use an impact wrench that's either pneumatic or electric. But if you're old school, you can also use a breaker bar or a 1/2-inch wrench with an extension with a mount. Now take your time taking the wheel off. It's going to be pretty heavy. These are pretty big rims for the stock Platinum series. You're going to want to take them off in the star pattern and make sure that you're taking your time. Lift your jack up just enough so that the wheel can freely spin without touching the bottom. Now, if your rims have been on for a while, or if you've been going for a long drive, like on a road trip or something like that, and creating a lot of heat for long duration drives, you might have a situation where your rotor is stuck to your rim. To solve this problem, you can use a rubber mallet or something like an aluminum mallet and hit the edges of your tire. Do not put too much force on there because you do have a wheel bearing in there. You don't want to damage that. You can always tap from the back side and the front side, but the goal is just to loosen that surface rust. Once you're able to get the rim free, you can wheel it off and you can expose your caliper and shoe, which you're going to be repairing or replacing the caliper or the pads. Take your time and make sure you put the lugs in a safe place. I always like to put them back on the studs themselves, and this will keep them from falling or losing which one they went on, because sometimes the threads get a little bit screwed up over the years, so that way you can use the lug that was already on it so you don't have to fight the threads. Once you have them back on there or in a safe location, you can locate your caliper, which is actually mounted on the shoe next to the rotor. I'm going to spin the camera from behind and show you the 2 bolts that you're going to have to remove. Once you found the bolts that you're going to have to remove, get your socket set ready with 3/8 drive, and that'll be able to remove these bolts. And if they don't loosen with 3/8 drive, get your 1/2-inch drive and you can loosen up that way. And if they're still giving you a hard time, use a breaker bar on the 1/2-inch drive and give it a good snug pull or push depending on the angle that you're at, and you'll be able to get those bolts free. With brakes, I do not recommend using a torch because you're going to burn those boots that hold those caliper pins in. Now you're going to want to secure your caliper up with a piece of wire or string depending on what you have available at the time. You're just going to want to make sure that that flex hose is not having any tension on it. Now with whatever you're using, make sure you have enough length to be able to tie it up to the shock mount or to the frame, and that way you get the tension off of it and you're not securing to a wrong point. And when you tie it off, make sure it's not in the way so that you can still compress the piston that's on the caliper. You're going to want to make sure that you can move it around and still work on the caliper and the pads and everything else like that, and the clips, and make sure everything is on there correctly and grease and lubricated so that you can have a squeal-free installation. Make sure you take your time taking these bolts out. Do not force them to come out because then you could snap them, as they do have a lot of heat and pressure, as they are the only things holding your calipers to your rotors. If you have to, you can loosen them and then tighten them a little bit at a time, and this will also free up anything that's sticking it. You can see this is the length of the bolts. They're pretty long, but they're not super long. Just make sure they don't get dirty or lost. You have 2 per side. Take them out. Doesn't matter which one you take out first, and this will make sure that you can drop the caliper and free it up so that we can do the rest of the brake job. Remember, you can use your 3/8 drive. I wouldn't recommend a 1/2 inch down here unless you're just trying to loosen it. It's just unnecessarily bulky and hard to get this in there in this tight area. Now you can use a screwdriver on the edge of the caliper. Do not hit the rotor itself if it's a little bit hung up like this, because the pins aren't loosening and we want to make sure that we can pop them out and fix that. That was the whole point of this. Now get your C-clamp. You can use a C-clamp over the old brake pad. When you use the old brake pad, it'll allow you to compress the piston on the caliper without putting any sort of pressure or indenting things that you don't want. If you have it fully compressed, you can then assess the piston and the rest of the components on your caliper to make sure that it's not seized up and that's not your problem, as you'll be replacing anything that you need to get back to functionally operational on these brake system. As you can see, our pads were heavily worn out and they were also grabbing a little bit. The piston's not hung up with the pins that slide your caliper and pads in and out with the pressure that it needs to push onto the rotor. Those are getting a little seized up, so we're going to make sure that we pull them out and we address anything on there and re-grease them. This will allow us to get rid of any sort of squeal that we had that wasn't related to just the pads getting a little bit too worn down. Now, what you can do is take a wire wheel or a flap disc and take it all the way around. This is a nylon flap disc attached to a M18 Milwaukee drill. This will allow me to remove any heavy scaling or anything else like that without me worrying that I'm going to gouge into the rotor and cause any sort of impact that will negatively stop the car from braking the way that it needs to. This is why I'm using the nylon flap disc over a wire wheel, but if you trust yourself with a wire wheel, you can use that too. Now you can take your time with this, put it on the slowest speed if you want to, so you don't have to worry about it jumping around or out of your hands. You're going to want to clean up everything that you can, even the caliper, the edges of the rotor. This will allow you to have another chance of having less squealing on your car when you go to brake. And it'll also eliminate any sort of things that could fall in against your rotor and your pad and cause heavy marring when you go to brake. What you're going to want to do is turn on your air compressor at this point. We're going to blow out all the dust. Make sure you're wearing a respirator and you're blowing it away from yourself. And as you blow it away from yourself, make sure that you can get away all the dust and particles that you need so it doesn't get stuck when you're trying to install the new grease and the new pads on there. Alright, we're going to pop out the old pad that's held in by the piston right here. Use a screwdriver and you can pry it free. And this way it'll pop right out, no problem. There's also another one with a whole 2 clips on the outside. You can pry that one out too with the screwdriver. You don't have to worry about bending the clips as you're not reinstalling these once again. You're going to be installing a new set. As you can see, there's a huge difference between the new and the old set. There's a lot more meat on the new set, so you're going to have to compress and put this on there. And it's going to be a little bit harder of a press on versus the old pads. Once you get it all set and ready, you can use your desired grease or lubricant on your pins. We're going to be putting this CRC, ceramic silicone infused grease. This is what I like to use on my brakes. It's highly rated and it's highly heat rated too, so you're not going to worry about it burning off or loosening or stiffening up. This is really good stuff, and I've used it on a lot of jobs, and I never had an issue with the actual material of this lubricant causing problems with the brakes in the future. You can even put a little dab on the actual caliper itself where it goes in, where the piston is, and it seats those clips on the one brake pad. This will help eliminate some sort of chatter or anything else like that. It's not a true necessity, but I always like to put a little bit extra because it doesn't actually hurt anything putting too much. Alright, you can push in the new pad on the bottom end, right where the piston is. It holds itself in with the clips on the bottom end. And then we're going to slide on the new one. This one, you can guide down the edges of the caliper. The ends of the clips will both go on each side of the caliper, and you'll be able to see them click on. And once you know that you're at the correct length that you need to, we can get ready to set these back on the rotor. Take your time because the clips will fight you. They have to be at a certain point, and you'll know when you're actually clicked in, like I said, because it will actually feel snug and it won't slide around as easily. Once that's done, we can set it back on the wire that we used tied up, or the little string that you use to hold back and make sure that the flex hose isn't flexing the wrong way or putting pressure on it. By getting the pressure off of the hose, you'll ensure that there's not a chance of breaking it, causing any swelling, or anything else like that will cause a leak or a failure. Once the weight of the caliper is secure, you can actually clean out those pins, pull them out, wipe them off. If they're rusted, you're going to have to remove and replace them. But if they're actually in the condition that I have them in, where they're still shiny and look almost new, you can just clean them up real well, use a degreaser, and put new grease on there, and now allow them to slide back and forth again within that rubber sleeve. Once you make sure that they're sliding very well underneath their own free power with pushing very little on them, then you can reinstall the caliper. And if the caliper needs a little bit of pressure, you can use a rubber mallet, but do not bang them on or force this on. If it's not sliding on, there's a problem with the installation that you did. You got to make sure that the piston is down all the way. If you have the right rotors, if you have the right pads, if the clips are correct, all that stuff is really important to make sure that it's all in correctly and it can be reinstalled correctly. As we do the other side, I'll show you how we did the clips that go on the brake shoes and everything else like that, because there's one more step that I didn't put on this process when we installed it. It'll actually be on the next part of this video, so stay tuned. And I'll make sure I can show you that clip going in correctly, and then that way when you're doing your brakes on the rear, you know that you have to replace those. Unless you're still trying to reuse the old ones and just clean them up. If you're going to go that route, use some brake cleaner, pop them off, and use a wire wheel or a nylon brush and get rid of all the oxidation. That way your pads don't get hung up on surface rust. Alright, once the caliper is mounted, take your factory bolts and mount the caliper to the shoes and torque them down to the factory setting. They'll have the poundage that you need online to make sure that you're not over torquing them or putting too little torque where they can loosen up again. Once you're done with that, put some anti-seize on the rotor surface so that the wheel can't stick to it, and a little bit on the lugs. And this way you'll have no issue, and your rim and rotor won't get adhered together with a cold weld or something like that from surface rust and basically needing to be rubber malleted off or using an aluminum mallet so you don't ruin the bearing to pop them off. This anti-seize will let them fall right off real easily. Now you can mount your wheel at this point so you can drop it down on the other end and you can work on the other side so that there's no issue with having both wheels off if anything ever happened. I had to crank up my jack just a little bit to get that extra little bit of height to get the wheel back on, because once I set it down on the jack stand I was able to just get a little bit less height. So to get that height I needed out of it, just jack it up a little bit, get the other wheel back on and take the jack stand out, and we're going to go to the other side. Of course, before we go to the other side we had to put the lugs back in, and we're going to set them on with the impactor. Do not over impact them because you can break the lugs off. Set them on the most sensitive setting or bolt sensitive. That way you don't snap the stud off and cause a secondary problem and have to redo everything and then have to redo it and put a new wheel bearing on. Or just a stud on the wheel bearing itself. When I thread them on, I do it by hand, but if you trust yourself enough, you can use the machine and start the thread, but I never really like to cross thread it. I work with someone who likes to just set them on with the machine. If you do it at a slow speed, I'll show you how you can do it later like that. But I only recommend doing that if you trust yourself with the machine like that, or you've been working with things that long so you know that you're not going to cross thread. Twisting them on by hand is the safest method too, so if you're also just learning, I recommend setting all your bolts by hand first and then giving it crank down with the torque wrench to the correct torque that you need so that these wheels are nice and safe at all the speeds that you need. But if you trust yourself, use the impact wrench just to start it and set it. That way when you put it down on the ground, the wheel's not just spinning in the air before it's on the ground. That's why I like using the impactor to set the lugs on first, put the wheels on the ground, then I'll use the torque wrench to set them at the end to make sure they're at the correct factory torque rating. What I've learned when doing lugs is to tighten in a star pattern, always alternating between the sides. That way when you're torquing it down, it doesn't unevenly torque it down and favor one side over the other. Typically in mechanical work, you usually jump around from bolts and you don't go in a straight line anyway, because that can cause uneven wear or tightening, which will cause a leak or something like that. So this is just a way that I have implemented doing tires, and I'm sure everyone else does the same. And if you made it through this video this long, you basically made it through the first side. And any other little tips and techniques I'm going to show in the last little bit of this video, so if you want to see any other tips on how to do your Armada, stay through this. But if you already got the gist of what you need to do, you can click on a way through and check out the rest of my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. But everyone else who's looking for some extra tips, I highly recommend staying through to the end. I'll show you guys how to do those clips on the shoe that I didn't get to show you before. So stay tuned, and thanks again, guys. Remember to like and subscribe and follow my channel for more. I restore classic cars and work on all types of cars. Alright, we finally made it to the other side, so we're going to bust these lugs free, starting with this one right here, and slowly work our way around. Now, you can use the breaker bar to loosen this up with a 1/2-inch drive. Any bolt that's a little stuck, the best thing that you can do for it is use a breaker bar. Spray a little bit of penetrating oil on there. Let the bolt soak for a little while, or the stud, or the nut, whatever you're trying to loosen, and then you can get it off with a little bit of friction and power. That's just a little tip. I know most of the experts or anyone who's watching this, they already know that, but for any of the amateurs just starting out, that's what I recommend. Do not try to force a bolt off right away. That's how you snap something, or worse, you end up ruining the part that you're working on and you pretty much have to throw that away and you're out a bunch of money. Anyway, back to this. I didn't need to do any of that. I didn't need to spray anything on my lugs for them to come off. Just a little bit of pressure with the breaker bar. It's a 1/2 inch drive. It took it right off. Then you can follow through with your impactor to take them off so it's nice and easy so you don't have to sit there spinning forever. Alright, now I'm at a conundrum where the rim is stuck to the rotor, so now I have to use some brute force to get it off. I know we have to worry about the wheel bearing and not damaging it or anything else around it. So anyone who does this method that they see me doing right here, it's up to you. Take the risks that you want. This is just a little bit of effort with an aluminum mallet and loosen it up. I am not putting too much force on there to try and hit it where it's going to damage internal parts of your suspension. You're going to hit it right on the rubber part, pop it off, and this will loosen up the surface rust because there is no anti-seize in between these parts. Now, after working on cars, this is why I put that thin layer of anti-seize so that the rotor and the rim don't get stuck like this again. And I don't want to have to hit on it to get it free because that's the only way that you're going to get this rim off. Just like the last side, there's 2 bolts that hold the caliper to the shoe. Right now I'm busting it off with my Craftsman, and it's pretty much a very light duty bolt that is very easy to bust free with a little bit of force, as long as it's not seized. I consider myself lucky as I live in the Salt Belt, and I pretty much am working on a vehicle that's from 2015, so these bolts haven't been out in a long time. The vehicle was purchased low mileage, so the last owner did the brake jobs before we purchased it, and ever since then we have maintained it, and it's finally at the point where we had to do a brake job. After using the pry bar to remove the caliper as it was just a little bit stuck because those pins weren't sliding in and out as good as they used to, we're going to compress this piston with the old brake pad. When you use the old brake pad with the C-clamp to compress it, this will allow you to not rip that seal or damage the piston itself. And then again, once you're fully compressed, you can remove the old brake pad, loosen up the C-clamp, and see what you're working with. And then we can remove the last brake pad. I use my pry bar. You can always use a screwdriver if you want and just lift it up. Those little clips are keeping it on there, and you don't have to worry about damaging these because you're not reinstalling them. Now re-secure your caliper with the wire that you used on the other side or the string that you're using to the frame or to your suggested area that you like to clamp to. And then once that's done, you can actually start to descale and use your wire wheel or your nylon brush to take care of everything around that area that you're re-securing. That means clean up the shoe, the caliper, and any other parts that you deem worthy wire wheeling or using the nylon brush on. You can even do the edge of the rotor as long as you don't hit the surface itself where the pads grind and go up against, so that way you're not going to cause any gouges or anything that damages the rotor itself. That's why I like using the nylon brush or the nylon wheel on your drill and keeping it at a low speed because you do not want it to get out of hand and you just want to remove some of the scaling and the rust so that it will have less of a chance of things falling against your pads. Now you can take your time with this process and do it until you're satisfied or until you think that it's good enough for what you're trying to achieve. And once you're done with that, take out your lubricant of choice to put on there and use that grease to put it on those guide pins, on the caliper areas where your pads sit and ride on those clips. Once you have the grease on the edges of your brake pad, on those clips that go in against the piston, you can slide in on the piston itself and clip it in. Now you can use the grease on the edges of the other brake pad where the clips hold on to the outside of the caliper. Put some on the brake pads that ride up against the clips. Now it's going to take a little bit of pressure to get this to clip onto your caliper. They're going to slide down. You can put some pressure, kind of give it a little bit of a quick hit, and now allow it to slide down, but don't be too forceful. You don't want to break anything. You don't want to bend anything. Once you get it back into the correct spot, you can move on to the next step. Which the next step is the same thing that we did with the guide pins on the other side. We're going to make sure that we have this all correct and everything is going to be all greased up so things don't get stuck again. Now I recommend having gloves on at this point because you're going to spread the grease on there. But if you don't use your finger to spread it out evenly, you can always do it when it's inside the actual rubber area itself. Just spin it around and make sure that it gets all around inside that cavity, and that way it has an even, thorough lubrication for sliding up and down. Just make sure that these guide pins are at the right spot so that the rubber can grab onto them correctly and be protected. This is a certain spot that it has to grab onto, which I'm showing right here as we're working on the brakes. There's 2 per side on these calipers, so take your time with these guide pins and grease them up very well, sliding them in and out, up and down until you feel like you have the perfect level of movement. Alright, once you're done with that, put your caliper in a safe spot because we're going to be putting those clips on the caliper carrier, which I call the shoe, which I know is not the correct term. It's just a slang term I've been using But back to it, once you get those in, we're going to be moving forward with the last few steps. You can use a rubber mallet to get them on there and make sure that they're on there correctly and as tight as they can be without damaging them. Alright, so once that's on there and everything's all correct and has the right spacing on each side of the caliper carrier bracket, alright, put your grease on those areas that you need, and now we're putting the caliper back on. And now we're not going to force it back on, but if you have to use the rubber mallet to give it a light little tap, make sure it doesn't grind or grab anything, that means it's not on correctly. You want to make sure it pretty much glides back on. Alright, now get the bolts that you removed in the beginning of this, and we're going to reinstall them. You can put a dab of the grease on there if you want before reinstalling them, and we're going to put those in and hand crank them down and then tighten them back up. Make sure you have the factory torque spec out and ready to go with your torque wrench after this, or you can give it a couple ooga doogas, but basically you want to make sure that you feel comfortable with what you're reinstalling. I like to do the factory torque spec and make sure it's all done. I use my Craftsman, which is only 25 foot-pounds. You can use that to crank it down. Then you can go back around and use the torque wrench right before you're done. Alright, we're at the step where we're going to put some anti-seize where the rotor hits the rim. And we're going to make sure that this doesn't get stuck again. You just need a thin layer. That way it doesn't have to get stuck and have any rust or corrosion that happens where it does kind of like a cold weld, where those two materials that aren't the most compatible create an oxidation and reaction, which makes it almost impossible to get off without some force. Alright, so put your lugs back on and we're going to start cranking them down with this impact wrench. Now it's on bolt sense mode, so it's not going to over torque them, and then we can go around with our torque wrench at the end and make sure everything's at the correct pounded. Once you go around in a star pattern a couple of times, you can get your torque wrench out, twist your dial and make sure that it's close to what you need it to be or at the factory spec to make sure that everything is going to be safe and sound with these wheel studs. Alright, so you made it through your brake job, and now you know how to do your Armada brakes, or maybe know a little bit more if you were just intrigued on what it takes to get these Armada rear brakes back on. Thanks again, guys. Remember to like and subscribe and follow my channel for more. I restore classic cars, and I also work on vehicles just like this, and I like to make videos to show people what they need to do to get their vehicle back in operational condition, or do things that I've learned as new tricks that maybe not been uploaded yet. Thanks again, guys, and I'll see you next time.